holding 82B2. 82B2. Paid days on the days. We're holding on the right-hand column on the bottom.
By the two dots.
By the two dots, exactly. So, said the Mishnah, Nitmu ha'ba'olim oy shemesu to ubar tzerosan. If, after the Korban Pesach was brought, the owners become tamei or they passed away, so obviously immediately it means that they can no longer eat from this Korban Pesach. The Mishnah says, in kozeh, we wait for the Korban to change its appearance, to start becoming putrid. And on the first day of Chol Hamoed in Eretz Yisrael, or the second day of Yom Tov, the first day of Chol Hamoed, you would burn it. Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroika said, no, even here you would burn it right away. You don't have to wait for it to change its appearance, because at the end of the day, nobody's around to eat it. Since nobody can eat it, you might as well get rid of it right away. So what's the fundamental argument? Says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yosef, Machlokes shenitmu bolim achazirika. The machlokes is only where the owners became tamei or passed away after the throwing of the blood on the Mizbeach. We're on 82B3. We just turned the page, 82B3. Di ischazu basar la'achila. So that means at the time that you slaughtered the meat, you slaughtered the Pesach, right, and that you threw the blood, at that moment in time, everything was peachy. The owners were here. They weren't tamei. So the meat, in other words, had a shas hakosher, had a moment of being good. So it was good. So in such a case, since there was a moment where the meat was slaughtered correctly, the blood was thrown correctly, and only after that the owners either passed away or became tamei, making it impossible for anybody to eat from it. But that means there was a moment in time, a shas hakosher, when the korban was perfectly worthy of being eaten. Since it had a moment that it was good, we do not simply burn it. You need to go ahead and wait until it changes its appearance and becomes putrid. But if the owners became tamei before the throwing of the blood, or they passed away before the throwing of the blood, so that the meat never had a shas hakosher, never had a moment that it was okay to eat it. In other words, if the owners become tamei before the blood is thrown, you know what happens? Immediately they're puzzled from having the Pesach Rishon, and they're immediately mechayev to have a Pesach Sheni next month, which means they are no longer in the parsha, no longer in the classification of people who have to be in the korban on Erev Pesach. They're immediately in the classification of people who have to bring next month, which means that this Pesach is no longer a Pesach. This Pesach can't be used because the owners aren't even mechayev to bring it anymore. They're tamei, and certainly if they're dead, they can't. But let's stick with tamei. So since the lo yichazi basar la'achila divrei hakol yisaref miyad, in that case, everybody agrees that you immediately burn it right away, and you don't have to wait for the meat to change its appearance. Says the Gemara Meisvei. Let's see if this is true. Let's see if this holds water. Zeh klal. I've got a brayso that says as follows. Zeh klal. Kol shebesulai begufai. Any offering, any sacrificial offering, who becomes invalid, and the psul, the invalidation, is in the etzem korban, is in the cheptza de korban. It's in the animal itself. The answer is yitzaref miyad. It should be burnt at once. But the brayso goes on to say, bidam, with blood, ubibolim, and the owners. If something should happen, if the invalidation is not in the meat, it's in the blood of the animal or in the owners of the animal, tabur tzarosa. No, you got to wait for its appearance to first change. The yotzah lebeis hasreifa, and then you take it out to the place of burning. Ketani. Now, what does this brayso do? This brayso says Ba'alim Dumya the Dam, that the owners are compared to blood, because the Brisa says the Dam or the Bailam, or blood or the owners, right? The Bailam are being compared to Dam. Now, Ma Dam Lefnei Zerika, now just as the invalidation of the blood, Al Karchach, we're forced to say that the invalidation must have happened before the Zerika, before the spraying of the blood. You know why we must forced to say that? Because once you spray the blood, everything's done with the blood. We're finished with the blood. So we don't really care what happens afterwards, after we spray the blood. When we're talking about dam that becomes invalid, that becomes psul, we're forced to say it must be before the zrika. No, it's before the zrika. It's just like the dam is before the zrika. Therefore, the owners, which are juxtapositioned together with the dam, right, are also their invalidation must have happened before the blood was thrown. And yet, what does this Brisa say? Even in such a case, when the invalidation happens before it's thrown, to uvat sarosai, you still have to wait for it to change its appearance. No, that's a kasha to what we said before, where before we said about nitnu bailam lefnei zerika, but if the bailam become tummy before zerika, you can burn it right away. You don't wait for it to change its appearance. So we've got a steer between this and that. Says the Gemara says you're right. To Elamai, we have to explain by BJC like this. Itma hochi itma. This is what he's saying. Machloikis shenitnu bailam lefnei zerika. The machloikis is where the owners became tamei or passed away before the blood was sprayed. So that the basar never had a shasakul kosher. There was never a moment when the meat was going to be able to be eaten, because you become tamei before the zrika, automatically you are no longer in Pesach Rishon. You're only now you're mechuyev in Pesach Sheni. But if the owners become tamei after the zrika, so that the meat, so the meat that definitely had a moment in time when it was perfectly able to be eaten. Everybody agrees that in that case, the invalidation is stemming from an external factor. What's the external factor? The factor is that the owners became tamei. That's the external factor. The animal itself is perfectly good. The animal itself is perfectly good. It was slaughtered correctly. The blood was sprayed correctly. Everything was good to go. And then after the fact, after the zerika, the owners became tamei. So it's a problem in the owners, not in the animal. In such a case, then we need a change of appearance. It needs to become future that allows us to burn it. Rabbi Yochanan says, he says the truth is this argument is after even after zerika. That means that there was a moment when the meat could be eaten. There's still a machlokes, because the Rabbi Yochanan and Baroika will say no. They'll say the bottom line is at this moment in time, can the meat be eaten? No. Yes. When you did the zerika, the meat could be eaten. But 5 minutes later, the owners became tamei. The moment the owners become tamei, fafuch, the meat can't be eaten. The fact that it had a moment that it was allowed to be eaten doesn't change the facts now that it can't be eaten. If the moment I tell you it can't be eaten, I say burn it right away. You're going to tell me the soul, the invalidation is not in the animal; it's only from an outside factor. The people says Rabbi Yochanan, I don't care what the factor is. The bottom line is I look at the bottom line. Bottom line is you can't eat it. Burn it now. Get rid of it. That's it. So it says the Gemara, Ba'az the Rabbi Yochanan the Tamei. And in fact, Rabbi Yochanan follows his own reasoning. The other Rabbi Yochanan says as follows. Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroika Rabbi Nechemia Amr Dober Achar. Rabbi Yochanan, the Amora, says that the Tanoim Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroika Rabbi Nechemia Amr Dober Achar. They say one thing. Rabbi Yochanan Baroika Had Amrin. Rabbi Yochanan Baroika is like we just said, that what we just said, that there's even a machlokes when you come Tomei after Zerika, that you can burn it right away. Rabbi Nechemia Mahi, what's Rabbi Nechemia? The Tanya, because we learned in the Baraisa. Rabbi Nechemia, now we're getting to the conversation that my father got to yesterday a little early. B'pnei aninus nisrazu. Aaron HaKohen, if you remember when Nadav and Abihu died, so they were bringing a chatos to inaugurate the Mishkan, and at the end of the day, Aaron offered up the chatos, but he did not eat the carbon. The reason why he didn't eat the carbon is because of aninus. Aninus again, and this is important. Aninus again is when somebody's dead is laying in front of them. Minat Torah, there's a machlokes. Minat Torah, it's only until the first night, or it's until the body is buried. We all hold that a person is an aninus until the funeral takes place and the body is buried. But whether some of that is midrabanan or midrash is certainly the first 12 hours until the nighttime is considered aninus. So Aaron, obviously, Nadav and Abihu had just died. He said, I'm an oni, oine. HaKadosh Baruch Hu told me we have to bring the carbon. That I understand, that portion belongs to Hashem, like we explained yesterday. That's going up on Shulchan Gevaya, on the table of the Most High. That's where the emurim, the holy fats, and the holy parts of the base of the carbon are going up on the Mizbeach. But the other part that you're saying that I'm supposed to eat, you can't do the avodah only b'simcha, with joy. Obviously, I can't do it with joy because I'm in aninus. I have my dead lying here in front of me, right? And so Aaron made the cheshbon again that part you can't do. B'pnei aninus nisrufazu lekach nema ko'ele. That's why it says over there, now that such things befell me, ko'ele, like me. It happened to me. Ha aninus, now Aaron's aninus, we're on 82b4. Aaron's aninus happened in a state of his state of aninus happened after the blood was thrown. The blood was thrown correctly, and then they went in and they died. So that's the answer. Yet Aaron's chatos was burnt right away. Aaron's chatos was burnt right away without going on any change of its appearance. But according to what we just said, that shouldn't be the case. Right? That should not be the case because the meat had a shasa kosher. The meat was mutter to be eaten. It was only afterwards that Aaron became an aninus. So the problem wasn't in the carbon. The problem was an outside factor in Aaron becoming an aninus. Still, what do we see? What happened over here? His carbon was burnt right away, and we didn't wait for its appearance to change. So therefore, it follows that Rabbi Nechemia, who's the one who's saying this baraisa, that Aaron's thing was burnt right away. Nechemia is saying that the owners of the Pesach become tamei after the blood is thrown. It gets burnt after the yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. How do we know that?
Yeah.
How do we know?
Back up a little bit. Back up a little bit because it's not real.
How do we know? That's not very clear to me. Because Nadav and Abihu,
because what did you
Nadav and Abihu died before.
Moshe Rabbeinu's, because Moshe Rabbeinu's taina, if you remember the Gemara from yesterday, Moshe Rabbeinu asked him, did you slaughter the correctly? And he said, yes. He said, did you throw your blood? He said, yes. He said, if they did everything correctly, why didn't you eat it? Remember yesterday's Gemara? Gemara, there was the whole conversation. So Elamai, he threw the blood. Right.
So he answered him, Koela.
Right, Koela. In other words, like me. Yeah.
But the fact is that Nadav and Abihu died before the Zrikis Hadam. And still
right, but the fact is,
the Gemara says
he didn't know about it. He was involved.
What?
Right, but that's why the Gemara went before. The Gemara said before, if you remember the conversation between Moshe and Aaron, yesterday's Gemara, they went through the whole thing, where the Gemara says, when do you become Aninus? You become Aninus not when they die, when you hear about it. When you hear about the demise, that's when you become an Oinen. I can't tell you that, but that's when you become an Oinen. You become an Oinen when he heard about it. He threw the dam correctly. At the time that he threw the dam, he was supposed to throw the dam. He knew no other way. When did he find out that they had passed away? He found that they passed away after the dam was thrown. That's what yesterday's Gemara came and told us. The conversation between Moshe and Aaron. If you remember, yes, go back to the Gemara. We broke out the words. Every word was, did you do this correct? He said, yes, I did this correct. Did you do this correct? Yes. Did you throw the blood correctly? Yes. So why didn't you eat it? So then Aaron said, how could I eat it? And Moshe was masking. So that's what we're saying over here. Since obviously it's coming out that he threw the blood correctly. And only then only then did he get labeled with an Aninus. And so according to our way, the Tanakama, we should have changed faces. In other words, the animal should have gotten putrid before you could burn it. By the fact that it got burned right away is a proof that Rabbi Nechemia is holding right. Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroika, that's what he called it, that you can burn it right away. Once you cannot eat it, it doesn't matter the factor why you can't eat it, whether it's in the animal itself or an outside factor of the people, of the Bailam, it doesn't matter. That's the bottom line. And that's how Rabbi Yochanan is following. Rabbi Yochanan is saying that Rabbi Nechemia and Rabbi Yochanan Beroika all say the same thing, that once I can't eat it, it doesn't matter how it came about, go ahead and burn it. Very good. We're on today's daf. Hey Gimel Amud Aleph. 83A1. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Moisef Af, Rabbi Yossi HaGalili. Rabbi adds that Rabbi Yossi HaGalili also holds that when the violin become tamei after the zerika is thrown, so that means the zerika with the blood was thrown correctly, there was a time when the meat was perfectly capable of being eaten, then the owners became invalid, became tamei. In Kamzeh, he holds the meat could be burnt right away. I don't care whether the factor is an outside factor or in the animal itself, you can burn it right away. The Tanya, because we learn Rabbi Yossi HaGalili Omer, Kola Inyan Kuloi, the entire subject, Einem Medaber Elam B'Param HaNisrofim, the Sidam HaNisrofim. He says, as opposed to what we learned yesterday, that the pasuk which says, V'chol chatos, and any chatos asher yoboy midomoi elo oyel nechkaper b'kodesh le'toichel be'esh. He says anything we said yesterday was talking about where an outside chatos by accident was brought inside into the inner sanctuary. Rabbi Yossi HaGalili says no. This whole pasuk is talking about the inside chatos. The chatoses that are supposed to, the sin offerings that are supposed to be brought on the inside altar. And they were brought on the inside altar. And those inside chatoses are not eaten. We don't get to eat them. Any chatos that's on such a high level that it's an inner sanctuary chatos, sin offering, that we don't get to eat, it gets completely up on the base of Mikdash, on the Mizbeach, and its skin is burnt. Nobody gets to use it. So he says like this: the bulls that are burnt and the goats that are burnt. Now the ones that need to get burned in the place of the bira are those that have become invalidated. They have to get burnt in the special place known as the place of the Be'ir that we talked about the other day. And the pasuk which says The pasuk says, "Loi toichel," you shall not eat. Va'kodesh ti ve'esh tisroi. In a fire you should burn it. So the pasuk is coming to teach us that you shall not eat these chatas, meaning simple, not the chatas that became invalid, that inside chatases, sin offerings that are brought inside the inner sanctuary, on that altar in the inner sanctuary, those are not to be eaten, as opposed to the chatases that are brought in the outer section, in the courtyard, on the copper altar. Those, a portion of that you're allowed to eat. You can to eat, but the inner ones cannot be. That's the whole reason why it came. The only way this pasuk says to teach us that inner chatases are not like outer chatases, that they cannot be eaten. So he says the sages, they said the Rabbanon to Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, chatas nichtas dam lufnei minayin, and according to you, that if outside chatases that are done in the courtyard are by accident, the blood is brought inside to the inner sanctuary, how do I know that it becomes invalid? Because we use this pasuk for that. You're saying this pasuk is not for that. Amar lehen, Rabbi Yossi HaGalili says, I got another pasuk. Behold, its blood was not brought into the sanctuary within. You should have eaten it. Michlal, says Rabbi Yossi, the pasuk is going to say, that if the offering, the outside offering, goes out of its boundary, goes out of the courtyard, nami ayel dama, or its blood goes in to the inner sanctuary, the serefa, you got to burn it. So Rabbi Yossi is learning from the pasuk of Aaron's chatas that even in the later generations, future generations, any outside chatas that goes into the heichol, goes into the inside sanctuary, it becomes invalid, and therefore, since he's learning it out from Aaron's chatas, just like Aaron's chatas was burnt right away, so too any chatas that goes from outside into inside, its blood goes from the outside, from the courtyard into the inner sanctuary, should be burned as one. So therefore, Rabbi Yossi HaGalili is saying, even though the problem here is not in the meat, the meat is perfectly good, it was slaughtered on the outside, it's in the outside. It's that the blood was brought inside. So the problem is with its blood, not in itself. And he still holds what? It needs to be burnt right away. So therefore, Rabbi Yossi HaGalili is holding with Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroika and Rabbi Nechemia that no, we do not wait. We don't wait for it to change appearance. You get to burn it right away. And the same thing is with the Pesach. The fact that the Pesach now, even if the Bailam, the owners became Tomei, after the blood was thrown, so that it had a moment that meat could be eaten, says it doesn't matter. Now it can't be eaten. It's not in the meat itself, it's an outside factor. We don't care. If once it cannot be eaten, burn it. Get rid of it right away. Don't wait for it to change appearances. Now, the question only is, why did Rabbi Yochanan not mention Rabbi Yossi HaGalili? Rabbi Yochanan only brought Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroika and Rabbi Nechemia. Rabbi Yochanan Soba, Dam Osach Chad Milsihi. The blood and the flesh really are the same entity. They're the animal itself. So in other words, when I was saying an outside factor, I wasn't talking about the blood. I'm talking about the Bailam, the owners. Balan Milsachriti. The owners are a different entity. So even though Rabbi Yossi HaGalili holds that, he's explaining Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, the dam became no good because it was brought into the inside sanctuary. That's a problem inherent in the animal itself, according to him. The problem that's inherent in the animal itself, everybody agrees it gets burnt right away. So that's why he didn't bring it down. Very good. Hopefully, okay. Unfortunately, the Gemara doesn't really get any easier as we move along over here, but we'll do our best. Says the Mishnah, the bones, the sinews, the gidin, the ligaments, and the leftover flesh, the leftover meat of the Pesach, Yisru Rishisha also. You burn it on the 16th of Nisan. which is to say, all this stuff you have to wait until Chol Hamoed. You can't do it on Yom Tov. Chal Shisha Asa Lias B'Shabbos. If the first day of Chol Hamoed should just so happen to be Shabbos, when I say Chol Hamoed, by the way, everybody needs to know I'm talking about Eretz Yisrael, because in Chutz La'aretz we have obviously 2 days of Yom Tov. In Eretz Yisrael there's only 1 day, there's only one Seder, right? So with the Mishnah is obviously talking about what took place in Eretz Yisrael. In our world, we would, if you happen to be in Chutz La'aretz, it would be Yud Zayin. But we're talking about, obviously, we're talking about Jerusalem, we're talking about Yerushalayim, so we're talking about only 1 day of Yom. Chal Shisha Asa Lias B'Shabbos. If the 16th should fall on Shabbos, 83.
Even in
I couldn't make it out, Daddy. Say it again. No, back up. Say it again.
Even in Chutz La'aretz,
that's where you should talk from. Go ahead.
The second day, Yom Tov, is not the same as the first day Yom Tov, because you're allowed to bury a mess on the second day Yom Tov.
Correct. Yes.
So you see, it's
So
in a way
my father was saying is that the second day, right? Correct. The second day Yom Tov, my father was saying that if somebody passes away on the first day of Yom Tov, you're allowed to bury them on the second day of Yom Tov. In fact, the Friya Dika, the previous Wiener Rav, the Rav of Wien, Rabbi Leibowitz was his name, actually passed away on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Right. And we remembered that we actually came out of Shul, we came out of Shul in Atalis as the Aron was brought down the street. All the shuls came out just for 2 minutes to be lobby as it was the Aron, and they went ahead and they buried the body on Rosh Hashanah.
I thought Rosh Hashanah is a Yom HaRichta
at the time, but I remember it quite vividly. So that's very interesting. So here we have our case over here. Chal Shisha Asa Lias B'Shabbos. Yeah, Charlie, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying I thought the difference between
say
Rosh
it
Hashanah
again.
2 days is a Yom HaRichta, so that I would think that the rules would be the same for the 2 days versus, say, on Yom Tov. No?
No, it's only at the Rabbanon that you make it.
Okay. Got it.
But I don't know what, I'm having trouble hearing backwards. I'm sorry, Charlie.
No problem.
No, good. That's perfect. Don't go too close to the computer. We're all having the same problem. Let's try it again. No, ask again. What was the question?
No, I asked the idea that I thought.
Okay, we'll talk about it afterwards. Okay, no problem.
Yeah,
I don't know why I'm having. Well, it was a Yom HaRichta. Yes, it is. It is a Yom HaRichta. Exactly. Even in Eretz Yisrael, they have 2 days of Rosh Hashanah because we're not sure when the Yom Tov start, when Rosh Chodesh is. It's true, Charlie. Nonetheless, because at the end of the day, we really know that the second day of Rosh Hashanah is not Rosh Hashanah. We're only doing it because it's the tradition. We consider it already over here less of a thing, and we go ahead and we bury the bodies even on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. But let's go further because we'll never get anywhere, and we got a ways to go. So here we go. Chal Shisha Asa Lias B'Shabbos. If the 16th should fall on Shabbos, Yisrafu B'Shiva Asa. It should be burnt on the 17th, the next day of Chol Hamoed. Lefi she'ein doichen lo yaseh Shabbos v'lo yaseh Yom Tov. Because the command, the mitzvah to burn that the bones, the gidim and the noisa, the bones, the ligaments, and the leftover meat is not doicha the Shabbos. You can burn it later on. Okay, so now we're going to go like this. I need to, again, everybody please remember the following halacha. The following halacha is, remember a Pesach's bone, you're not allowed to break the bones. You're not allowed to break the bones of the Korban Pesach, of the Pesach sacrifice. You're not allowed to break the bones. Why would you break the bones? Because there's machbein in Yiddish. The machbein, the marrow of the bone. And I'm using the word mach because we're actually going to find out exactly where that word came from right now. It's in Rashi. The word that we all think is Yiddish is, in fact, that based in the language of the Jews. Jews always loved marrow bones. We love sucking out the marrow. How do you get to the marrow? You got to break the bone. Now, marrow is food. The problem is it's contained in a bone. So now, we just said that Pesach, the meat, leftover meat, needs to be burnt, right? If it goes past the nighttime. By definition, the marrow, which is inside the bones, is food. Since it's impossible for me to get to the marrow, because I'm not allowed to break the bones of the Pesach, automatically the marrow is going to become nicer. It's got no choice but to become nicer. Once you understand this, the rest of this Gemara is pretty easy. Here we go. Says the Gemara, Omer Rebbe Ramari Barabu, Omer Rebbe Yitzchak, Atzomois. Let me get to the place. I'm sorry, I lost the place. Here we go. Omer Rebbe Barabu, Omer Rebbe Yitzchak, Atzomois Kedoshim Shishimshu Noisa, bones of any offering, any holy offering, sacred offering, serves as a carrier of Noisa. It carries very Noisa, because I just explained it. And therefore it contaminates the hands, because it becomes a busser, a base for a forbidden object. What's going on? Goes like this. Like we're going like this. The bones of any offering serves as a carrier of Noisa. Says Rashi, look at the first Rashi in the Gemara. Shenoiser, leftovers, behen mach, the mach. There's the word, Daddy, mach, right? Shenoiser behen mach. There is the machbein, the marrow. The marrow, by definition, is going to be left over after the time of eating. And they're contained in the bones. Since they're contained in the bones, the marrow, by definition, is going to be nicer. So the bones are the carriers of nicer. Now, the rule is that the Rabbanan made that nicer, Rabbanan, if you touch it, your hands become tamei, and you have to go rinse and wash off your hands. Midiaraisin is no such thing. You can't have one part of your body be tamei and the rest of you be tamei. So it's only a rabbinical gezerah, because they didn't want people to get used to the idea of leaving over meat. So they wanted them to eat it up. So they said if you touch the leftover, it needs to be burnt, your hands become tamei. So here too, these bones, if you touch the bones, your hands become tamei because they're in nasa. They become a base for something that's awesome. You might remember this language. This is a lashon from Hilchos Shabbos. In Shabbos, you have this problem that if you have a table, but on the table is muktzedika things, are things that you can't use for Shabbos, are you allowed to use the table? Is the table saying, the table is good? And I meant use the table. I just left the muktzedika thing on the table. Or no, do we say the table is a bosses l'davar is a base for a forbidden thing, and it too becomes muktzah midirabanan? So that is a question in the Hilchos Shabbos, in the Masechta Shabbos. It's a big, big topic, and this is just piggybacking on that topic. So says the Gemara. Right. Should we say that our Mishnah is proof to what Rabbi Yitzchak is saying? It says the bones, the ligaments, and the leftover meat must be burned on the 16th of Nisan, on the Chalamoid of Nisan. What's the case of these bones? If you're going to say it's bones that don't have any marrow, so this is just like somebody like me who loves when my wife puts in machbeins, marrow bones into the chulent, and sometimes you end up with a marrow bone that has no marrow in it, and it's very disappointing. But so here you have a bone that does not have any it doesn't have any marrow, then in that case, nishnadu, just discard it, throw it out, right? There's no problem with these bones. You're not breaking them. Bones are not food. Bones are not food. They're there to be gnawed on. They're not there to be eaten. The bone itself can be eaten. It doesn't have marrow in it, so just throw it out. It doesn't have a din of a meichel. It's not a din of food. Elo pshita the isbur moich. So therefore, of course, it does have mach. It does have the moich. It does have the marrow. And since the bones cannot be broken because you're not allowed to break the bones of the Pesach sacrifice, the marrow will always become nicer. It's impossible for it not to become nicer. So the bones, by definition, are always carriers of nicer because they're carrying the marrow, which inevitably will become nicer. So then, if you say that something that serves as a carrier is in fact a real factor, that's why the bones always require burning. They require burning because they carry the moich, and you can't get to the marrow. Since I can't get to the marrow, the bones are carriers of nicer, and you got to take care of it. That's only if you say in halacha, carrying something, carrying the thing that's going to become nicer is problematic. But if you say, listen, the marrow is the marrow. The carrier of the marrow, that's not the issue. It's only the marrow itself. Then why would you need burning? Let's break open the bones after the offering has become nicer. After the offering has become nicer, simply break open the bones after the fact, after the time frame. In other words, let's say by the Pesach, break it open the next day. Remove the marrow and burn the marrow, and throw away the bones. Why do you got to go through the trouble of burning the bones? And it's a pain in the neck because bones take a lot longer to be burnt up. Says the Gemara, it must mean that the carrying of nicer is a factor, is a reality. It's something in halacha we say. It's like a basis l'davar. It's like a base for something that's also, and therefore the bones themselves have this thing called, they are a shimush, a carrier of nicer, and therefore they too have to be burned. Says the Gemara, Amri loy. No. No, it's really nothing. The marrow counts. What's carrying it doesn't count. What's going on? Because Savar and the Tanur of Mishnah holds that when the Torah says the etzem lo yishvu boy, and the bone you shall not break it, boy, it. That means the etzem lo yishvu boy, the bone you shall not break. You shall not break it. That means even in a valid offering and even in an invalid offering. Okay, the point of it is like this: the halacha of breaking the bone is once the offer has become invalid, it's no longer a korban Pesach. So therefore, in other words, it's teaching us that the idea of it is that it's only, in other words, the pasuk the pasuk is simply coming to tell us. So we would have thought this. We would have thought the logic would be that as long as the Pesach has a shame, has a name of a Pesach, that's when the rule that I cannot break the bones. The moment it becomes invalid, right, I would say, I'm allowed to break the bones. It no longer is a Pesach. Says the Gemara, boy. Says the pasuk, boy. Explains the Gemara, it. This animal that was brought as a Pesach, whether it's valid or whether it's not valid, you can't break the bones. Once it got a name of Pesach, you're no longer allowed to break the bones. So you want to go ahead and say, after the fact, I'll break the bones, take out the marrow, and then I'll burn the marrow and then throw away the bones? You're not allowed to do that. Once it has a name of a Pesach, even if it becomes invalidated later, it doesn't lose that name, you can't break its bones. Period. So break the Gemara. That means the bones themselves are not inherently a problem. They don't inherently require burning. It's simply the fact that I cannot break the bones, whether the carbon is good, whether the carbon became invalid, I'm not allowed to break the bone. So I can't get to the marrow, so I've got no choice but to burn the bone in order to destroy the marrow by fire, as is commanded. Not because the bone has any din of a basis as a carrier, as a base. It probably doesn't. But I got no choices in this case but to burn it because I don't got a choice. I got to burn the marrow. So, says the Gemara, is it in your mind that you're not allowed to break the bones even when it becomes invalid? Are you saying that? But we learned later on the next Amid, we'll get to it tomorrow, that we learned like this. The one who leaves over meat of a Pesach offering. That was tar. In other words, you ate your Pesach, but you couldn't finish the carbon. You couldn't finish eating it. Or one that breaks a bone of a Pesach offering. That was Tomei, that had become invalid, does not get lashes, does not get malchus. So you see that you don't get malchus if you break a bone of an invalid offering. So who says you're not allowed to break a bone even if it's invalid? So break the bone, take out the marrow, burn the marrow, and throw away the bones. What are you saying over here? What's going on? Like Kasha. Our Mishnah, dealing with nicer, is talking when the offering had a moment of validity, had a moment when it could be eaten, and only later it became tameh by being left over its time frame. In that case, the initial prohibition, which went into effect, there was a moment in time when this carbon Pesach could be eaten, which means, therefore, the rule of etzem lo yishbu bay, the rule that you shall not break a bone of it, was in effect. Once that rule goes into effect, even if later it becomes invalid, the rule, once it came into effect, it remains in effect, and you can't break the bone, and therefore you can't keep the marrow, so you're forced to burn the bone in order to destroy the marrow. Kan, in the Mishnah coming up tomorrow, we're now on 83A3. We're dealing in a case where the case of Tomei is where the offering never had a moment that it was valid. It was the Tomei happened from the outset. So since it never had a moment that it could be eaten, it never actually was a carbon Pesach. You might have thought it was a carbon Pesach, but in fact, it wasn't the carbon Pesach. The people bringing it would have to bring a Pesach shady. That's the reality. Since it never had a moment that a shas hakosher never had a moment that it could be eaten, therefore the rule that this bone you shall not break the bones of it, never went into effect. It never went into effect. So over there, go ahead and break the bone and take out the marrow. It's not a problem. So says the Gemara. Again, we're on 83A3. Who's the Tana who makes a differentiation between a time when there's a moment when it was valid versus when there was no moment when it was valid? Rabbi Yaakov, it's Rabbi Yaakov. The time, because we learn in a brayso, the etzem lo tishbu boy, and you shall not break a bone of it. Boy, it. The kosher, the loy, the pasul, means only when it's kosher, when it was a valid offering, and not when it was a pasul offering, when it was an invalid one. Rabbi Yaakov, no. Rabbi Yaakov says, no, even if a pasul one, you're not what it's called. But not every pasul one is excluded. In other words, even by pasul, you may not be able to break the bones. And if so, If an invalid offering originally was good, and then it became no good, then it's subject to the law, to the prohibition of against breaking the bones. Since there was a moment in time it was valid, so the halacha came online. The halacha that you're not allowed to break the bones came online, and therefore the prohibition is in effect. Once it's in effect, it remains in effect, even if it becomes invalid. But if it never had a moment, it never had a period of validity, it's not in, then that means that the law that you're not allowed to break the bones never came online. It never came online because you never had a moment that it was good. Rab Shimon says, this one that had a validity and later became invalid, and this one where it never had a moment of validity, is never subject to the law of breaking the bones. Says Rab Shimon says, once it becomes invalid, that's it. It loses its name Pesach. By definition, the rule that you shall not break its bone disappears, because that rule, says Rab Shimon, is not a rule exclusive. It's part and parcel of Pesach itself. If this thing is no longer a din Pesach, because I can no longer eat it, therefore the rules of breaking the bones don't apply at all. So says the Gemara, Meisvei, you're going to have kol atzomas, hakadoshim eintun in serefa. All leftover bones, this Brisa says, all leftover bones of sacred offerings do not require burning, except chutz me atzmos haPesach, the bones of the Pesach, b'nei hatakolo, because of the necessity to avoid a misdeed, which of course we know exactly what the misdeed is. Since breaking open the bones is a misdeed, the bones themselves must be burned on account of the marrow, because the marrow is food. The marrow is food, and since the marrow is food, it therefore would need to be eaten together with the Korban Pesach on the night of Pesach. Since you can't get to the marrow because you can't break the bones, by definitions they need to be burned. By the way, what's the case of these bones? Yeah.
No, I'm just saying the whole issue of breaking bones is only by marrow bone.
Daddy, I can't hear you.
The issue of breaking bones only applies by marrow bone, but not by plain bones that don't have anything.
Daddy, I'm not making it out.
Okay, forget it.
Yes, only the marrow bone. Only the marrow bone. Only the marrow. Right. It's only the marrow bone.
The regular bone without marrow, you could
not the other bones. You're right. It's not the other bones. You can get rid of it. Actually, Daddy, you could throw them out. So it seems that that's where we're headed. We're heading to the point: which bones can you break and which bones can you not? But at the moment, we don't have clarity totally. But it's saying over here, which bones are we talking about? Why do I need to burn it?
Throw it out.
It doesn't matter. But if you should say something that carries the noisa is a factor and has to be dealt with, why do the bones of other offerings don't require burning, according to this Mandiyama? Where we find bones that were broken open and emptied of their marrow. The bones of other sacred offerings, that don't have a prohibition of breaking the bones. Every other korban, you're perfectly entitled to break the bones. You're absolutely entitled to break the bones. Since you're allowed to break the bones, we could assume that they were broken open, then emptied out of their marrow before they became noiser. and therefore the bones are not serving nicer because they broke the bones. They're empty. It means we took out the marrow, we ate the marrow. Now the time frame passed. These bones have nothing to do. They're not carrying marrow, and therefore the bones don't need burning. But the bones of Pesach, the yesh ben mishum shviras etzem, that have a rule. Daddy, it's mashma from here that all the bones of the carbon Pesach, seemingly are not allowed to be broken. Whether they have marrow, whether they don't have marrow. The breaking of the bones, it would seem to be, of a Pesach is a universal. Every bone in the animal of the Pesach is not allowed to be broken. The yesh bohem mishum shviras etzem lebosa deniu noisu dechatzinu. We can assume that they went ahead and they broke it open and they emptied it from noisa.
Yeah.
Havilei or no. So therefore, we have to assume, since there's an isser to break any bone in the body of a Pesach, so these bones, we have to assume that since they are broken, they must have been broken when? After they became noiser, after the time frame of the carbon Pesach passed. So therefore, they had the marrow in the time frame, which makes them makes them a carrier of noiser, and requires burning. Rav Zvid said, what are we talking about? Kegoin, we're on 83B1. 83B1. Says the Gemara, what are we talking about? Tziburin, where we found the bones in piles. Umehem chalutzin, and some of them, the ones on top, are broken and emptied of their marrow, but the bones on the bottom, but he didn't check all the bones. He only checked the top layer of the bones, but he has no idea what's the story with the bones at the bottom of the pile. Atzvah's Kedoshim, concerning bones of all the rest of the other offerings, the non-Pesach offerings, which have no halacha about breaking the bones. You're allowed to break their bones. Therefore, we make an assumption. We can assume if I see some of the bones are broken, I can assume that all the bones in the pile were all broken and the marrow was taken out. And since the marrow was taken out, there's no food left over in these bones. And even though we're after the time allotment, they're not nice. The bones themselves are not nicer. You don't have to burn them, you can throw them out. But Atzmois Pesach, the bones of the Pesach, the Yesh B'Mishum Shviras Etzem, that are subject to the prohibition of breaking bones. We have to presume that we had the possibility that only the top bones were broken and emptied out, but the bottom bones were not broken and taken out. And therefore would require burning. So that's the case. It says the Gemara now finished with bones. So the real question is, it seems to turn out, the bones themselves are really nothing, don't need to be burned. The problem by the Pesach is you can't break the bones to get what goes on inside. If I can't break the thing to go on inside, it means by definition the bones are carrying marrow. They're carrying marrow. They're carrying marrow. By definition, I got a problem. Okay, because the marrow is food, and if it's left over after the time frame, it has to be burnt. I can't get to it, so I got to burn the bones with it. Now, my father's point that the only bones that you can break, you're not allowed to break, are the bones with marrow. The problem with that is you don't know which bones have marrow and which ones don't. Since you can't break them, you can't find out. So you now have to burn all the bones. That's the answer. If you want to say that the bones that the Torah says you're not allowed to break, that's only if you're a scientist. If you're a scientist and you know, or you have samicha in chulin, so, and if you have to be somebody like my father who happens to be both, so he knows which bones have marrow and which ones don't. If you're Jerry Abramson, you know. But the rest of us peons, the rest of us guys, who all we know about meat is what we buy in the butcher shop, right? Is what we do. We just know we go to the shelf and we pull it off the shelf. We don't ask how did it get to the shelf. We don't know. We don't care. Let's be honest. We don't care. We can't break any bones. And since we can't break any bones and we're the majority, then the Jerry Abramsons and the daddies of the world don't get to call the shots. So we can't break anything. That's the way it is. All right, let's go just a little further. Get a little further down. I'm trying to get to the 2 dots towards the bottom of here. So we got about 4 minutes. They call this, the English says sinews. So let's just call this the ligaments. It's the attachments, it's the elastic attachments between the bones. I consider flesh, except for the sinews of the neck. Jerry could probably talk on this more than I, but apparently that the stuff in the neck are very, very hard. They're really not edible. If they're not edible, they have a different rule to the game. Tanan, atzomas v'gidem noisa yitzu b'shisha asa. The sinews and the leftover meat must be burned on the 16th of Nisan. Hani gidem hechidami. What's this case of these ligaments? Ilen v'gidem basar, the ordinary ligaments of the flesh. Let's eat them. And if they're negligently left over, if you didn't eat them up, it's nicer and it needs to be burnt. We're talking about the ligaments of the neck. And it says over there, we mentioned it, what it called, those are definitely not going to be eaten. And from the outset, they should be burnt on the 16th. If you want to say they are considered basar, despite the fact that they're extremely hard and people really do not eat from them. So people don't eat from them, but they still have a din of basar, right? They still have a din of basar. Then why do they require burning? They shouldn't require burning. I mean, that's why that's why they need burning. If they are not flesh, they're too hard, and they're not considered food, why do they need to be burnt? Talk about the sciatic nerve, the nerve that would give them we're not allowed to eat. Regarding the eating of the gid anosh, we had this earlier in the Sechta. It's only on one leg. The gid anosh of one leg. The das marchev shel yamin, and my mind is inclined to say it's the right leg because that's the leg that was hit by the Rabbeinu. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, the permitted side, the left side really cannot be eaten. And reality is not eaten because we don't know for sure which one it is. He says, I think it's the right leg, but I'm not sure if it's the right leg. It might be the left leg. So technically, it's fit to be eaten. It's fit to be eaten. The gid anosh is technically fit to be eaten. It's just that I'm not 100% sure I've got the right leg. But that means, at the very least, one of these gid anoshes, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is food that technically is allowed to be eaten, and therefore becomes nicer. I can't eat it because I'm not 100% sure which leg it is. But one of the two legs, the gid, is definitely food, and since I'm not allowed to eat it because of the uncertainty, right? Because suffix arises l'chumra, an uncertainty in a biblical law, which is the gid anoshe, the sciatic nerve, right? You did where you go l'chumra. You don't eat it. Since I'm not 100% sure which leg it is that's good and which leg is no good, I can't eat either leg. The good leg, by definition, really is edible. If it's edible, it could become nicer, right? And since it can't be eaten, it stands from the outset to be burnt. Burn, it becomes nicer. That's why the Mishnah says it always requires burning. We're on 83b2, which is where we're stopping, right? let it be concluded that Rabbi Yehuda was uncertain which one is the Asa one. The because if he was certain that the right side was the Asr Giranoshe, Hahi the Itzulinechel, then let us eat the one that is permitted, the Yisur and the Shteitzer, and throw away the right one, the left kid. I wouldn't be able to eat. Lama Lisarei. But why do I need fire? No, it doesn't mean that Rabbi Yehuda was uncertain. He in fact knew that the right leg is the no good one, the left leg is the good one. You know why you can't eat it? Because they got mixed up. Because when you put them together, there's no way to tell the difference between a right leg and a left leg, Giranoshe. Rav Ashi Omar, Loi Nitzcha Elu Shamnoi the Giranoshe. The Mishnah is only talking about this only as a reference to the fat that's covering the Giranoshe. The Tanya. Shemoinei mutter, it's fats. The fats around the Giranoshe are mutter for eating. The Yisrael kedoshim heim, but the Yisrael are holy, and they have a tradition. They treat it as no good, as forbidden, because it's so close to the Giranoshe. Even if, and maybe there is a machlokes, if you remember, whether the Giranoshe gives off flavor or doesn't give off flavor. So this would be point to the ones that hold that it gives off flavor. Maybe flavor went into the fats. Either way, we say la halacha, you're allowed to eat it, but we Jews do not eat them. Rabbeinu Omar, Rabbeinu says, Bechitzon. We're dealing with the outer scenery of the hip. Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel. The Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel, Shnei Gidim. The hip has two Gidim. Penimi Asod Atzamach La'etzem, the inner one, which runs along the bone, is Asur, because that's, of course, the Giranoshe B'chayim Olav. And if you eat it, you get lashes, you get malchus. Chitzon Asamach Labasa. But the outer one running along the flesh, Asur, is in fact also Asur to eat, but the Ein Chayavim Olav, but you're not Chayav lashes, because in fact, Midia Raisa, biblically, you are allowed to eat it, but rabbinically, we say you're not allowed to eat it. Very good. We're up to the two dots on the bottom of Pei Gimel on the base.